Hi everyone, welcome to the second video of the Closet Feminist three-part series wrapping up our monthly column Covers and Content. In the last video, I took a look at Elle Canada, its cover stars and editorials for the past 12 months to see how they are faring in terms of diversity. For this video, I'm going to be doing the same thing for Fashion, Canada's #1 fashion and beauty magazine. As a quick recap about this project, Covers and Content is our monthly column where we go through each of the three major Canadian fashion magazines, Elle Canada, Fashion, and Flair, to see how they're faring in terms of diversity. When going through each issue, we ask three main questions. First, does the cover feature a person of color? Second, do any of the major editorials feature a model of color? And third, do any of the major editorials feature a plus-size model? So without further ado, let's take a look at what Fashion had to offer this year in terms of diversity. Fashion put out 11 issues this year, with their winter and summer issues covering December 2012 and January 2013, and June/July respectively. Fashion started out their year with Canadian supermodel Coco Roca on the cover. We love Roca for her activism, as seen in the last year especially with her efforts to protect the rights of underage models. At this point in the project, I'd like to introduce a phrase to describe a fashion magazine which has a white cover star and no models of color in their editorials. A whiteout issue. For example, I would describe the January issue of Fashion as a whiteout issue. Despite a great cover star, Fashion starts the year off with 3 editorials if you include Roca's cover story, all using thin white models. I want to emphasize that a whiteout issue is not something unique to Fashion. In fact, you might recall from the first Covers and Content video that Elle Canada had 6 whiteout issues, which technically comprised half of their publishing year. Returning to Fashion, February saw to another great cover star, Kristen Ritter. She's a Closet Feminist favorite for being an out loud and proud feminist and having great style. This issue is definitely more positive than the January one because it has 2 editorials, one of which stars model of color Grace Mahari. The March issue saw to Fashion's first cover star of color, Haley Steinfeld, who, incidentally, had nothing but good things to say about feminist superstar Tabby Jefferson. The March issue had 2 editorials, but both of them were disappointingly status quo, starring 1 thin white model each. The April cover of Fashion starred Canadian actress and star of the hit show Revenge, Emily Van Camp on the cover. While Van Camp's interview was great, the rest of this whiteout issue was a total disaster. The April issue has 2 editorials. The first one, called Tokyo Pop, is incredibly racist and offensive. I would even go so far as to say that it's portraying yellowface with its use of kabuki-esque makeup and samurai top-knot hairstyle. And I'd also like to point out, even though it's obvious, that this is not an Asian model. It's a young white model named Karina Gubanova. This train wreck of racism, Orientalism, and stereotyping was evocative of Katy Perry's highly offensive AMA performance. In both the fashion spread on the left and Perry's performance on the right, we see a white woman wearing a panoply of Asian-inspired clothing, though in both cases the outfits are being passed off as specifically Japanese. We see our white model eating sushi splay-legged on a sidewalk curb, and then sitting on a fire hydrant with a Hello Kitty pillow spread across her lap. Then again, what can I expect from a spread that is described as having, quote, cartoon colors and Asian cuts which bring a manga mood to the streets of Miami, end quote. Give me a break, Fashion. This spread sucks. The other spread, while not incredibly racist, is rather entirely forgettable, starring 1 thin white model. Fashion's May issue had Isla Fisher on the cover. Ironically, this is called the age issue, and poor Fisher, she's only 37 years old, yet to quote Arrested Development, Fashion airbrushed her into oblivion. This month was a whiteout issue, having 2 editorials, the one shown with a thin white model, but the other one was actually quite exciting. The second editorial starred 68-year-old Canadian model Donna DeMarco. DeMarco is white, but it's exciting to see Fashion stray from the status quo somewhat, as we know Fashion, and the media in general, worship youth and young models. Next we come to Fashion's summer issue, which covered June and July. It was a whiteout issue and starred Lana Del Rey on the cover. There were 2 editorials. One was Del Rey's cover story, and the other starred 1 thin white model. With August came Demi Lovato on the cover, who is a woman of color. I will say right now that Lovato's cover story was my favorite of Fashion's publishing year. I wasn't really all that familiar with Lovato before I read this interview, but I will say now that I am a total fan. She shared some brilliant insights and definitely seems like she's a feminist, even if she didn't explicitly say so in her interview, and you can't go wrong with that. Lovato's inspiring attitude evidently caught on with Fashion in August because Demi had her own editorial and the other one printed starred a model of color. Next up is the big one, Fashion's September issue. For the most important issue of the year, Fashion chose Olivia Wilde for their cover. They had two editorials for their September issue, one starring a thin model of color, the other starring two thin white models. October to me was curious, to say the least. Canadian supermodel Daria Wearbury was on the cover, which, by the way, is her 9th cover for fashion. I'm sorry, but if Wearbury has had the cover 8 times before, why didn't they go with someone different, like, say, a woman of color or someone who is plus size? Even though her interview was quite good and she had lots of interesting things to say, it seemed like a wasted opportunity to diversify their publication. Before discussing the other October editorial, I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce another new term, a token diversity spread. A token diversity spread is when a fashion magazine hires an ensemble of models, being careful to choose a few models to represent minorities, but never allowing such models to make up the majority in a shoot. Like a whiteout issue, a token diversity spread is not unique to fashion. For example, I noted in the first Covers and Content video that one of Elle Canada's May editorials, called Graphic Games, had what I would now refer to as a token diversity spread. They hired 9 striking women, and while they were all sizes and ages, just 3 of the models hired were models of color. Getting back to Fashion's October editorial, I would say it's a token diversity spread. To be honest, I was a bit stumped with this one at first. While Fashion declared the shoot to be experimental, I found that to be code for poor lighting and distant shots of the models' faces, which, until you zoom in on the pictures like I've done here, it's a little tough to see at first glance that there are women of color present at all. Indeed, between the darker lighting used for the shoot and the fact that they unfortunately yet unsurprisingly didn't name the models anywhere in the magazine, I cannot say for certain how many models of color were booked for this shoot. I can say, however, that there was at least one model of color and that none of the models used in this editorial were plus size. Fashion's November issue had Miley Cyrus on the cover, 10 days after her tour de force racist performance at the VMAs. Given this and the offensive editorial from back in April, we seriously debated canceling our fashion subscription, which we discussed with our readers on the Closet Feminists Facebook page. While they may have chosen a problematic cover star, their editorials were a slight comfort. There were 2, one starring a thin white model. The other November editorial was a token diversity spread of Canadian models, with 2 out of 7 models being models of color, and no plus-size models to be seen at all. Fashion closed out the year with the surprise appearance of Courtney Love on the cover for their December 2013/January 2014 issue. Overall, December was a whiteout issue. They had 2 editorials, both of them starring thin, white models. Okay, so let's recap. Fashion during 2013 put out 11 issues, and only 2 of them featured cover stars of color. They had a total of 23 editorials printed this year, and of these 23, 5 featured models of color. However, keep in mind that since 2 of these editorials were token diversity spreads, just 3 editorials starred models of color exclusively. There was not a single issue of Fashion that featured a plus-size model this year. I gotta say that overall, Fashion is probably my least favorite Canadian fashion magazine right now. It's like Vogue, and not in a good way. It's elitist and focused on a culture of luxury that isn't relevant to me as a reader. Furthermore, diversity to fashion seems to mean hiring a thin black model occasionally. For example, they didn't hire any Asian models this year, but they hired a white model to do a yellow face spread in April. Bottom line, I'm not seeing enough visible minorities represented in these pages, nor am I seeing any plus-size models. So, while it would seem that Fashion did really well this past year in terms of diversity, in fact, they technically did better than Elle Canada, I'm sorry to say that I just don't have high hopes for Fashion in the 2014 year. Then again, they could change things up, and this time next year when I do this review again, I'll have to eat my words. I guess we'll just have to wait and see. At any rate, join me next time for our 3rd and final video in our annual Covers and Content wrap-up. I'm going to be taking a look at Flair and how they fared in terms of diversity these past 12 months.